Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to the follow-up webinar from FETL's 2018 annual lecture. We're joined today by Professor Mark Stein, who gave the lecture. Professor Stein is based in the University of Leicester in their business school and agreed to do the webinar because we had so many questions on the floor by the time we'd finished that we were persuaded to actually entice him back again to cover some of the topics. You'll recall that FETL is about the leadership of thinking, and we want to be as helpful as we can to the sector and system in bringing contemporary issues of leadership, indeed institutional life, to the fore. So, Mark, thank you for coming to be with us again. And I think you'll know from the quality of the questions from our colleagues and the interest since that actually the lecture has been found to be incredibly helpful and provocative.
Just to set the context a bit, because I thought it's worth saying something about how I stumbled across this topic of whistleblowers. This was not something I was particularly focused on. I was looking at the management of risk, and particularly at organizations that had collapsed and various crises and disasters in different sectors. And what I found, and I wasn't looking for it as I mentioned, was that in every case there were whistleblowers. In every case there were people trying to stop these untoward events. And so I thought this is, really quite important, and really one needs to think about, well, what happened to these people? So I looked then at what we know about whistleblowers, and while there's quite a lot of diversity of information, what I think is fairly consistent on the whole is that whistleblowers are treated terribly badly. They are vilified, they're scorned, they're stigmatized, they're excluded, they get treated terribly badly. And I was trying to work out, well, why that is. I think that's kind of the real question I'm trying to address. And while there's a range of different opinions about that, what I found was that underlying these different views was a kind of a core assumption which I felt was not helpful, that was not really enabling us to answer this question. And the assumption is that people hate the whistleblowers, in other words, staff members hate the whistleblowers because they represent the other. They represent somebody different, the opposition. It's a kind of us and them scenario, a kind of warlike scenario. And while I think in some sort of obvious sense that must be true, there's also another sense, and this is what struck me, was that at a different level, it seems to me, almost the opposite is taking place. That the real problem is that staff members have colluded with something, they've done something, they've gone along with something, and they know that in these cases. And that means they've lost something of their good self. And what happens, and what's so irksome to them, is that somebody stands up. If you're standing up and objecting, it means you're standing up and you're enacting that. You're being the voice. You're saying something. You're saying, stop, we're not going on with this. And I, the staff member, find that so irksome because you are representing something that I've lost. You are the lost self. And that's really what's so difficult, and that causes a lot of difficulty, embarrassment, awkwardness, and shame amongst staff members. And I think then what is interesting is that then gets converted into hatred, that people can't stay with a sense of shame. They cannot acknowledge, they cannot think about what the whistleblower is drawing their attention to, and they kind of shoot the messengers. They turn on the whistleblower because the whistleblower has had the gall to speak the truth when they've lost the ability to do that.
Okay. The questions we've received today, I think, reflect the complexity of the topic you've been exploring for some time. And so I'm giving an alert to people looking in to listen carefully, and we'll do the best we can with them. Actually, John Bazalgette from the Grub Trust I think connects to some of the things that you've already raised, and his question and comment is as follows. He's exploring the hypothesis that in many public service bodies, for example the NHS that you've talked about, the police, prison service and so on, the experience of shame at an organisational level frequently bedevils executive leaders and the management in the college, in the institutions. Colleges in our case. This paralyses those who are accountable for moral standards across their organisation. Internal and external whistleblowers are thus left to exercise the moral conscience of the organisation as a whole. Whistleblowers then become the victims of the ill-directed backlash that so often occurs in these situations. John asked for your comment, Mark, about that kind of hypothesis, that the move to shame becomes very, very difficult and very different in its acting out.
Well, I think it's a very interesting point, and it's completely consistent with what I've argued in my talk, which is that what is being triggered is a sense of shame, and that this might be quite present in the organisation. But I guess what's interesting about John Bazalgette's point is that I argued about the kind of shame in individual whistleblowers, and he's saying, well, that speaks of something about the organisation, and I think that's a very interesting addition to what I said, which is that actually the organisation has an identity, and it's lost something, and this is being triggered by the whistleblower, and we're on the line when the whistleblower stands up, and it's shameful and it's difficult. But as I've said, the real problem is that this shame then gets turned into something much more malign. It's not a matter of staying with it and thinking about it and addressing the issue as best we can. What tends to happen is that people turn on the whistleblower and blame the messenger.
And I was interested myself in the relationship between kind of guilt and shame, and then it's moving to aggression, because some of the cases we heard about, the cases you talked about in the lecture, really ended up being quite vicious. Okay, so again, moving on to another fairly complicated question. Actually, this is from somebody who I think has been through a whistleblowing procedure herself. She asks if you know what work or research has been done on looking at the positive and unexpected outcomes of whistleblowing. And she gives examples of increased synchronicities, peak experiences. She talks about bliss, love and compassion, forgiveness, etc. So these unintended, unexpected consequences. She says that in a cost analysis of her own case, that's an estimate, without any compensation or redress to herself, would hover around £1 million, without any change or benefit to the patients or to the public. Again, asking if there's research or work being done to look at opportunity costs of these cases. She goes on to ask another question, but do you know of research in this area? Are people taking time to learn from this and to see it in a wider frame?
Well, I certainly think there's evidence to show that some whistleblowers kind of have another life, so to speak, beyond the whistleblowing. They go on to join a community of people who are addressing certain important issues. They find a sense of camaraderie in that, and some of them win awards and they get recognized publicly for the whistleblowing. So I think it is true to say, and she's right to mention, that actually whistleblowers do sometimes have rewards, and that's pretty clear. But I really want to qualify that by saying that I think we need to remember that most of these people have been through hell before that and often during that, and that the trauma that you go through in the organization at the time is so severe that sometimes the rewards pale in comparison. Whistleblowers tend to say, when you ask them or you read about their accounts, they say to people, I wish I hadn't done it. It's just too painful, it's too costly, I lost my job, I had all kinds of personal issues. That's typically what happens. So it's not that I want to discourage people from doing it, but just to say that there is a price to be paid, and you've got to be pretty robust to manage that price.
I mean, I think we heard some of that from some people who had whistleblowing in the audience, and of course the film of the whole lectures on FETL's website, to go back to that, but saying the same thing. One of the additional questions asked by Bernie is, what do you think about NHS operating whistleblowing support schemes for NHS whistleblowers? I detect a concern in this, because the support systems use the same NHS mentality, corporate language, actions and behaviours that led to the whistle being blown and escalating in the first place. So people from within supporting whistleblowers who are of the same culture, the same language and same belief systems. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think people doing work in this area tend to say really what you need is a variety of different channels, that you can't can't rely on one. There should be lots of different ways to address issues, and there should be different ways to blow the whistle. Some should be internal and some external. The internal ones, which might be managed by the organization or the sector, as she indicates in the question, have limits. But there should also be external ones. You should be able to go outside the sector to register your concerns.
The next question comes from Sir Jeff Hall, who actually touches on the same points. So Jeff was a principal of a college, had been director of education, had worked in government, and eventually ended up on the Principals Council, which is a body that supports principals who want some support in difficult circumstances. Let me say that. And he talks again about the spectrum of complaining on the one hand, right through to whistleblowing on the other hand. And he talks about some high-profile cases in further education that I remember, where the wrongdoing, and it was found to be wrongdoing, were exposed through complaints and or surrogates, and that protected the individual in the institution who brought it to the attention of surrogates from the group's wrath, is how he describes it. So from people turning on the whistleblower. And one of the cases he mentioned is Paul McInerney, who was the General Secretary of NATFE, the Teachers' Union. And the other one was a very well-respected civil servant who pursued a complaint made to him about a college. And he wondered why that happened, why taking it outside protected the whistleblower in some way, because a complaint is whistleblowing by any other name at some early stage. And actually the belief that had the complaint gone outside, then the FAFC and the government would have examined that complaint. He refers, I think, to the fact that the funding councils now are part of the internal government. So a kind of fear around that they won't really investigate things because they belong to the organisation, they own the organisation that's being complained about. That seemed to me to kind of reinforce your point about having a variety of places to go to and a way of protecting the whistleblower. Let me read to you 4 observations of his during this time, where he talked about unpublished cases that he was involved in and how staff in the institution were kept compliant. And he names 4 factors. The staff were well paid themselves and had the fear of losing that. These are human responses. Also the belief that the principal had the backing of governors and funding bodies, so there was no point maybe complaining. The belief that the principal was doing things, on the other hand, for the benefit of the college and the community, and to an extent, in some cases, the principals did think that's what they were doing. And also teachers saying, well, what's that got to do with me? I'm here to teach my students. So do you recognise that? Does it make sense to you?
So lots of different issues here, and in fact I think on the issue of the sector, Ruth, I'd very much like your view on it, because you'd have a better picture than I would. But if I start with the first point about the spectrum, Sir Jeff Hall says that there is a spectrum from complaint to whistleblowing, and I think in some sense that is right, and we need to understand it like that. But in some sense we also need to qualify that, because in my view, when you get to whistleblowing, you get to a point where in some way the organization has broken down, because any ordinary healthy culture in an organization should allow complaints, disagreement, discussion, a space to think together, space to converse. That should be the ordinary kind of the ordinary course of events in organizations. But if you move along that and you're having to get people to blow the whistle about these very important, these are not incidental small things, these are very important serious misdemeanors and problems and risks that haven't been noticed. If you get to the point that somebody has to blow the whistle, it indicates that that culture is in some way broken. And I think that we need to acknowledge that. A healthy organization should not have whistleblowers. It should happen, people should just be able to discuss things. So I guess that's the first point. Do you want to comment, Ruth, about those particular cases? Because I think you have a much better
I
picture.
do. I mean, I was
would.
certainly a very new and young principal when all this was going on, and of course looking to my elders and experienced people to offer role models and guidance. When your lecture happened, I remember thinking it's not just about the individual being labelled as difficult, or indeed the organisation. But we lived through, and actually to some extent still live through, the fact that the sector itself was seen to be a wee bit dodgy. So because things had been found to be quite wrong, we were newly incorporated and independent for the first time. And I'm furious about that still, actually, because one individual or three individuals did something wrong. The ecology certainly paid a price and lost all sorts of benefits. But the whole sector did. And it became very clear that the truth in Whitehall was watch out for those colleges that can be a wee bit dodgy. So the loss of trust for the whole sector was very painful. And the suspicion around principals and governing bodies in their role was really tyrannical. It stopped people getting bids and so on. So, and actually that's still somewhere in the fabric. I meet somebody who says, oh yes, FE, it's FE and skills, this is this. So I think it goes wider than the individual and the organisation. This is a sector. And of course, I'm very clear that students wear the livery of the FE sector, and therefore there's a risk of them not being seen in all their achievements because they came from FE and not schools or somewhere else. So it was a high price to pay, worthy of pursuit, because I think principals now are much more careful. One of the unintended outcomes is that the arising of a new morality, I think.
I mean, that's fascinating. I think just to link that with some of the literature on whistleblowers, I mean, really what you're talking about is the kind of toxicity of it, how you can't contain it. If there has been whistleblowing, it spreads, the kind of sense that you're all culpable, even if you have nothing whatever to do with the problem. And what it reminds me of is the way in which it also affects individuals and family members. There's a particular case that I can think of where the wife of a member of staff happened to see a whistleblower at a supermarket and started talking to the person and was noticed by a senior manager. And shortly after that, her husband, who's the innocent member of staff, lost his job. So this is toxicity. It's about the idea that you may have nothing whatever to do with the problem, but by being tainted in some way, by being connected with it, you suffer. And it's worrying. It's something about how cultures work and tend to locate blame in places where they shouldn't do.
I think my memory as well is that they changed and distorted the behaviour of governing bodies, who became extra alert and actually more controlling, I think, of some of the organisations unnecessarily, because we're talking about 3 out of 460 colleges at that time.
Yeah. Just to take the last point, Ruth, about that question from Sir Jeff Hall was about remuneration and fearing the loss of your job and so on. And I think, it's absolutely true. He is right. People do not voice their opinions because they are worried about their livelihoods, whatever their remuneration. It is a serious risk. As I've said before, you put your head above the parapet, and oftentimes it turns out that you suffer. You might, as many whistleblowers do, you might lose your job. Ultimately, one way or another. It's not always that clear or direct, but it ultimately works out that way. So people are understandably scared. Thank goodness we have some who are prepared to take the risk.
And it is understandable, as you say. There's another comment about the toxicity going further, I think. You'll remember that in some of the examples you gave, some very aggressive actions were taken against whistleblowers by people who were not of the organisation and not of the, not part of the shamed place, whereby they act aggressively. So we have a question from Martha Mingay, and who says, in relation to the aggressive actions from ordinary people in the community to the whistleblower and their property, one member of the audience said she saw these vicious acts in the sense of people's own fears, so the community members' fears that the places they had trusted and would need at some time might let them down, and that the whistleblower was hated because they indicated that it was true that there was something untrustworthy going on. Will you comment on that? Does that seem plausible an explanation to you?
I think that is very plausible. I think, in those situations, we hate the truth.
Yes.
We don't want to know this, and somebody standing up and saying, "Look, there is a problem here," confirms our worst fears, and that's very uncomfortable. Yeah.
And I recognise the kind of dependency that says, I will need hospital, police force sometime in my life.
Sure.
And you have to, we invest in them a goodness that society needs. So I thought it was a very good explanation from Gabby Braun. Another question from Kerry Goodwin of our own organisation, who is an expert in governance. And she talks about the government code of practice on whistleblowing highlights that it is best practice to create an organisational culture, something you've talked about already, where workers feel safe to raise a disclosure in the knowledge that they will not face any detriment from the organisation as a result of speaking up. And she asks two questions. How can organisations develop that culture? And how can we in society support whistleblowers? So developing a culture where it is safe to say uncomfortable and unwelcome things. What thoughts do you have?
Well, in a way, it's a leadership question. It's about how you create an environment where people can feel that they can bring their concerns, their thoughts, their different views. Organizations are full of diverse views, and we need to make room for them. So I think that's really, one of the really important things to say about that. It's about making a kind of thinking space and creating an atmosphere where that can happen alongside these formal structures and channels for whistleblowing, both internal and external. But I think what often happens, sadly, is that the structures are put in place, such as they are, and the culture doesn't match it. So people in the organization speak as though we have an openness and an inclination to listen to diverse opinions and so on, and the reality is that that's not the case. So I think this is about the failure of leadership. Leadership needs to make that possible. Society, well, I think the fact that we pay so much attention to whistleblowers is probably the best thing we can do to support them. It's a damn lonely business. It's very isolating, it's painful, it's difficult. You're made to feel alone. That's part of the way stigma works. You're often isolated geographically, or you're shunned, people won't talk to you. And the fact that people in society pick these things up and kind of recognize what somebody's done as a whistleblower, I think is very important.
I mean, these questions from Kerry put me in touch again. I was been very preoccupied by Jeff Hall's comments about bringing in NATFE, the General Secretary of the Trade Union, bringing in a respected retired civil servant, that bringing in another good other in to investigate this somehow or other kept the system inside the organisation intact. Because it was somebody from the outside saying this isn't good enough, not somebody from the inside risking saying this isn't good enough. And the kind of comfort in that. So my own thought was the importance of procedures, recognising trade unions, having places to go to if you're uncertain. Because I know personally of some people who wanted to whistleblow but actually realised it was something that wasn't the right way to do it and brought in elsewhere. So forces from society, forces of authority from society coming in and looking independently, I think eases, from my memory, certainly eased the shame that staff felt. So they remained confident in their roles as good teachers and important contributors to the community, because somebody from outside was doing the work that enabled them to stay good. I think there's a real lesson there for people who are in leadership positions as they set up cultures to make sure to respect these external other people. And Kerry's point about the community support. I mean, having heard your lecture, I know that I will make it if I come across people in these terrible times. I would want to be knowing how the whistleblower was. Not just colleagues in the sector, but saying actually what support are they getting. And I think if we remember what we've heard about how difficult it's been and what can happen if you don't declare yourself to be wanting to know the truth, not taking sides, but wanting to know the truth, I think there are big risks in that. Moving on, our next question is from the further education professor Martin Dole, who's based at UCL Institute of Education. And he says, without risking the vilification of whistleblowers, how best might we handle malicious or vexatious complainants in identifying them and how they should be treated. So he's saying actually sometimes it's not true what people whistleblow on. How do you handle that situation? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is that, well, first of all, there are always people who complain. There are always people who just enjoy voicing their opinions, and maybe for good or bad reason. That's kind of what you have to live with in an organization. And I think we need to make a big distinction between people who complain about this or that and people who are whistleblowing about serious, significant problems. These are illegal activities, misdemeanors. These are situations where often life is at risk. So there's an important distinction. We have to live with some complaint, and we have to find a way to do it. Sometimes there may be circumstances where people complain in inappropriate ways, and we may have to address that. But whistleblowing is very different, and I think this is the tricky part, but the important part is finding a way to listen to people and having that open culture we spoke of a minute ago, having the culture where it is possible to say, well, tell me what you think, what is your concern, let's think about it together. The whistleblower is trying to help us, and we need to bring them on board to think about the issue they're addressing.
Martin also wondered about whether the context of whistleblowing and the treatment of whistleblowers are different in different sectors. So health service is a matter of life and death, and whereas other areas might not be that. We've seen financial issues in the city and so on. Do you have a sense of that? Do you have a sense of what makes a difference where people will take very lonely paths to bring something to the attention of others?
Well, I think one of the key issues is to what extent what goes on in that sector is in the public domain. To what extent people are concerned about that. So in Britain, we're very concerned about the health service, for example. So if you whistleblow in the health service, it's going to be something that might be picked up by other people. There might be other sectors where nobody has a clue what's going on and people aren't particularly concerned. And I think that certainly makes a difference. So those sectors where there is real public interest, the quality of what goes on and how it plays out is going to be different. I think the other issue connected with this is the way the channels are organized, the way the whistleblowing works will make a difference. So, for example, in the airline sector, there's a confidential, independent authority where you can blow the whistle, and that means that it works in a very different way compared to a sector where no such channel exists. So they're all a bit different.
It's a bit like the use of NATFE, the trade union of the staff. There's an independent and separate body. Okay, let's move on. I'm aware of time. We have an anonymous question from somebody who asked us not to reveal who they were. And he talks about the lecture was focused on scenarios where senior managers were party to guilty of malpractice, or where they were not minded to listen to and act on whistleblowers' disclosure. He would be interested in our reflections on what good looks like in this field. For example, where senior managers are not party to and are keen to listen and protect as required the whistleblowers. He ends by saying, what arrangements should organisations have in place and how should they handle disclosures?
Well, obviously in a brief conversation like this, one can't really specify what would be the ideal arrangement. It's also, there are a lot of other people working on this, but I think the main points would be, first of all, in terms of the practical arrangements, a number of different channels. You do not want whistleblowers to have to rely on one particular method. There might be lots of reasons why one channel will work for one person, another one will work for another. Whistleblowers also they need to be able to escalate the problem. So you might talk to a certain person within the organization, and if they do not heed what you say, if they do not take it seriously, you need to then escalate it. So there's got to be a way in which the channels are kind of different order. So you can begin with the most appropriate low-level discussion with a boss, a manager, and then move on to other channels. So there's something about a kind of different levels of channels. And I think the other area is culture. So it's obviously important that the channels exist, but it has to be complemented by a culture where people are encouraged to talk, to voice their opinions, to discuss things, and not to have to hide if they feel that there's something of concern that they need to share.
I am really, again, preoccupied by the notion of the importance of culture. And I think you may remember me saying during your lecture itself that actually people flee to hide behind procedures. And they're important, and please don't misunderstand me, I know how important they are. But actually they quite often exclude difficult truths. And my own experience and seeing what other colleagues have done brought home to me the fact that there needs to be another communication stream before it goes formally into procedures, because once procedures start, you are locked out of possibilities. And actually that's not about leading, that's about something else completely. And to my surprise, on a couple of occasions when I've had complaints to either handle or to hear as an external some appeals against the decisions made, I was very taken by the fact that whistleblowers themselves knew what would help them. So they knew that if they spoke to HR, certain things would happen. And actually having that space in the procedures, a pre-procedural space, whereby conversations can take place, not with people involved and confidentially done, and maybe not even from the organisation itself, felt really important. People knew what they needed to heal themselves, keep themselves safe, and to heal the organisation. So that I thought was very crucial. I think I sent you, and if you haven't got it, it's just because it's not arrived. So following your lecture, Ricky and I have been preoccupied by how do you, again a comment from John Bazalgette, how do you help shamed organisations repair themselves? And I bought this new book because this is a well-known writer doing that. Because what FETL will hope is two things. First of all, don't get yourself into these difficulties. Be more available and create a culture where people can come forward. But actually, if shame is visited upon individual heads or the head of your organisation, what can be done about that? And I think this is by way of saying that FETL is interested in actually organisations who have repaired themselves, who have handled the shame and forgiven themselves and one another and gone on to recover. Do you have any experience of that? I mean, working with organisations who are coming out of being shamed, or is that something that's still worth another annual lecture from FETL?
I think that's the next talk.
Okay.
No, it's certainly possible, and I think it does happen. I just can't, off the top of my head, think of a particular case. But it's the work of organisations is to deal with crises and problems and find a way to come out of it. And I think some have done. It's not, it's not impossible. Can I just add one other thing, just to connect with some of the things you said earlier on, which is around how leaders deal with the notion of openness, because we've both been saying how important that is. And I think one thing one has to be really careful of is that there are some organizations that pay lip service to openness. They have lots of wonderful mission statements and lots of wonderful terms to describe how they function. They also have formal procedures. There's a discussion event, there's times to meet the head of the organization and so on, and you can have a one-to-one chat with them. Now, that's all fine, there's nothing wrong with that. Where it gets problematic is when that's not kind of complemented by real openness. In other words, you do voice something in public. You do go to the meeting and say, look, I have this concern. Or you do meet your boss or the head of the organization and say, look, I have this worry. And the next thing you know, you're being moved to another part of the organization. The next thing you know, you're being moved out of a project. This is what happens to whistleblowers typically. Sometimes it's explicit, and sometimes they might lose their jobs, and sometimes it's very subtle, or it's not clearly linked with the complaint. You just get shunned, you get excluded, you get left out of things, and I think that is where the problem lies. That it's that communication. There's got to be some consistency in the way these things are dealt with, and I think there has to be something about an organization's capacity to tolerate difference and diversity of views. I think that's really important.
And those comments make me think about it's not just the individual whistleblower that is shamed and excluded and derided in some way. There's also such a thing in my mind now as an organisation that's been whistleblown, that doesn't get the chance and for a decade can carry the reputation of being, oh, that's where that happened. So the organisation, the institution itself becomes whistleblown and contaminated by the reputation of other people, in the same way that learners were delivery of the college and employer trainer that they went to. Organisations carry that delivery too, and I think that's all the more reason for us getting underneath the skin of this further and trying to encourage the openness that you talk about. Mark, thank you very much. Thank you for your time in coming back and taking questions that people didn't quite get to make from the floor, and for further reflections on this. It's important, it's particularly important in modern times. So we're grateful, and I'll see if I can persuade the FETL trustees to think about this thing about repair and shame.
Thank you.
And I think just to remind our colleagues who are with us, who are attending, about FETL, and check the website. All that we do is there to be spread. And I was thinking, had I been a new and younger inexperienced principal, to have something like this, the film of the lecture, this webinar where we've talked about it further, I'd be taking it into my organisation, and I'd be asking my board of governors to look at this, to hear some deeper levels about things that I know scare them. So I'm hoping that colleagues watching and colleagues who will watch later will be able to find a use for the film, will be able to find a use for the webinar, and actually might start to think about how, as an organisation, they can create the kind of culture that I think we're both agreed on, is one where actually goodness can be defended and protected for all in the community. Thank you very much, Mark.